Welcome back to the most accurate podcast here at 4 for 4 Football. As always, I'm your host, John Daigle. And joining me today, friend in life, in the cave, doing projections for everyone ahead of a big week 4, none other than the man himself, John Paulson. Paulson, how's it going?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm surprised you didn't tease me about my attire today. Like, this is the first time that I've worn a jersey on the live stream, but I got my Jordan Love jersey last week, and I'm sporting it today because it's game day. Just be thankful that I didn't pull out my son's cheese head because it doesn't fit quite right, and it leaves a mark on my head.
As someone who supports big hats, I would have absolutely supported cheese heads and whatever props you have. I'll give you today. I'll allow you to be biased since it is game day for you. And we have to get right into that one because there's a lot of questions about players participating tonight. Before we begin, reminder, still not too late to join with all of the rankings, the projections everyone's using, the DFS content we have, the weekly waiver wire that's still popping every single week in depth for everyone at 4for4.com by using the promo code YouTube for 25% off. Not a monthly price, 25% off for the rest of the season. One-time promo code YouTube. Get in there. And we're going to discuss and preview a lot of those rankings today, including tonight's Thursday night matchup between the Packers and the Lions. And let's begin with the Packers side of the ball because per most reports coming out, I'll just stick with Rap Sheet over at NFL Network. It sounds like both Christian Watson and Aaron Jones, after limited practices, will be available tonight. So now everyone dives into their roster and says, okay, where do I rank these players? And let's begin with Christian Watson because he's a tough one to figure out if he's even limited in this game.
Yeah, I think the language that was throwing me a little bit off today was their workloads will be managed or, possibly limited snaps.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's accurate or not. That might be it's a little bit of gamesmanship. The Packers tend to be very conservative with their injuries, and they don't roll anybody out there that they don't feel is 100% healthy. Now, Dobbs did play week 1 and was a bit limited, so that we might see something like that where Watson normally is playing 80-90% of the snaps, and tonight he's playing 60 or 70% or even less, just to sort of protect him, I guess. But this is a key game, and not at all shocking that they sat out after limited practices last week ahead of the Saints game and to come out and play a few days later in this one, because I think the Packers know that this game is more important than the week 3 game against the Saints. And I think they're going to pull out all the stops in order to get the win. I have Watson ranked right now at 34. It's dicey with him because he's, coming off the long layoff. He's got a brand new quarterback. We haven't seen the two play together a whole lot. But when he's on the field, he's the fastest player on the field. They often take deep shots with him. And Jordan Love has the highest ADOT average up the target right now in the league. So I'm sure there's going to be at least 1 or 2 deep shots to Watson tonight. So he's got a low floor and a high ceiling, I think. What about you?
I'll be interested to see how the target tree shakes out because we just don't know who really will emerge behind Watson, assuming he's even the one who wins the team high in target share between Jaden Reed and Romeo Doubs. So no answer there. I would start Watson over those two this week personally, but I think a lot of people are in situations where they have Christian Watson, Jerry Jeudy, Terry McLaurin, Brandon Ayuk, even those kind of start sits as fringe wide receiver 2s. And so it's really nitpicking when we're discussing who to start him over. I think it genuinely comes down to your own risk tolerance, you being the people listening at home and watching now, and whether you decide to run him out for a couple big catches, since I'm assuming that's how they'll use him in this game. What about for Aaron Jones in a tough spot against the Lions front 7?
Yeah, Detroit's second in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs, and we're going to start talking about that metric a lot because we rolled out adjusted fantasy points allowed using 2023 data starting this week. So now we have 3 weeks of data to go off of, and it's a little bit different than raw fantasy points allowed. We're able to adjust fantasy points allowed for schedule difficulty. So if a defense, for example, faces 3 really tough running games in a row, then they're getting credit for that when it comes to their strength of schedule in terms of what kind of matchup they are for opposing running backs. So that is an apples to apples comparison, and we use that a lot now from week 3 on, or week 4 on at 4 for 4. So I just wanted to mention that. Detroit pretty tough in that metric. Second, Aaron Jones is the running game has not been going well the last couple of weeks with AJ Dillon. Aaron Jones should provide a boost there, but they're probably going to make most of their gains in this game through the air, and I think Jones will be able to contribute in that area quite a bit. So I've got him at RB 15 right now. It's high end RB2. There is some concern that he may be limited in his snaps. We might see a kind of a clunker game because we get those from him occasionally due to usage. But they know they need him to win this game, so I think they will use him.
And I know the landscape at running back right now, so I'm sure fantasy managers have no choice but to need him as well. And we will talk about a lot of those running backs and what to do with them as we move game to game. On the Lions side of the ball, though, David Montgomery also expect to return. Montgomery, of course, averaged 18.5 carries per game through the first 2 weeks before he got injured in week 2. And that allowed Jahmyr Gibbs instead to step up for 72% of the backfield touches in week 3. But I think we would expect Gibbs to go back into his pass catching role and Montgomery to return to his early down role. Where are you ranking Montgomery ahead of Thursday night?
Yeah, if Montgomery's fully healthy, I could certainly see that. Right now, I've got him at 28. It's a tough ranking. Gibbs is at 16. The Packers are actually a pretty good matchup for both players in terms, they get gashed in the running game. It's kind of the plan is to bend but not break that defense, and they let teams kind of get into the red zone and where the field's compressed, and then they try to get their stops there. It seems they don't spend a lot of time trying to stuff the run. It just doesn't seem so. I think that that Gibbs and Montgomery are both viable plays. I might have these two ranked a little closer together by game time. It just depends on how Montgomery's looking and if we're getting any reports about his workload. If it's going to be the week 1 workload that we saw in Kansas City, he's going to need to be ranked a little bit higher.
And both tight ends, I would think, extremely viable. The Lions allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, and Luke Musgrave's route participation has increased every single week. Same as Sam LaPorta, the first tight end in NFL history to have at least 5 catches in his first 3 games as a rookie to start his career at his position. So 2 players I have the utmost confidence in. And again, whenever we're parsing matchups, which we basically are doing every single week from tight end 7, 8 on, I look at this matchup for both players, and I think I am starting both of them tonight. Any other things to clean up here before we move on?
Yeah, I just would mention that LaPorta I have at 4 this week. He's a strong play. Musgrave at 11, and I'm a little less confident that Musgrave's target share will be there due to the addition of Christian Watson, but he seems to be in the game plan every week for 4 or 5 target role, so he should be involved.
Josh Reynolds, also, quick note, was averaging, as we mentioned last week, 17.8 PPR points per game through the first 3 weeks. And then I think it's the injury he was dealing with as to why he was hampered in week 3, popped up late on the injury report, and then, of course, just laid an egg in fantasy. But if you're desperate and 12-team super flex leagues, let's say you have 1 or 2 flexes, it's a situation where, sure, maybe I don't trust it as much, but I don't mind going back to him if I'm forced to, given some of the matchups that we'll talk about as we move along here. So let's begin with, where the hell's my doc? Oh, here it is. Okay, let's start with the London game, because 2 Monday Night Football games is not enough. Now we have to wake up early in the morning for the Falcons at the Jaguars. And by all accounts, Paulson, I understand everyone's worried about this, what has been miserable Jaguars offense, bottom 2 in EPA per play if you look at the advanced metrics, but hasn't been bad on film from Trevor Lawrence. It hasn't been bad in other advanced stats from Trevor Lawrence. What's really happening is his wide receivers letting him down. Calvin Ridley, another 2 drops last week, including a 30-yard touchdown. And now Zay Jones, it's only Thursday, but still banged up. It seems like we're going right back to 2 wide sets and really a concerted target tree between Calvin Ridley Christian Kirk, and Evan Ingram. So your thoughts on the Jaguars offense this week?
Yeah, I mean, I generally, I don't know if you feel the same way, but I have, a general feeling that they're going to get this straightened out. I mean, relative confidence in Doug Peterson. I think Trevor Lawrence is a good quarterback. He has talented receivers. They have a pretty good running game. Travis Etienne's playing well. He's a top 5 running back for me this week. So I do think this will get sorted out. I'm not too worried about them, generally speaking. Atlanta's defense is okay. The Packers did well the first 3 quarters against them. Then the comeback for the Falcons last week, Detroit, beat them pretty handily. But it's not like a special defense or anything. I think the Jaguars could score some points in this one. So I'm fairly optimistic, especially about like a player like Christian Kirk, who maybe is a fringe receiver, wide receiver 3 type start under normal circumstances, but with Zay Jones out, I think he's a pretty solid wide receiver 2.
And makes it so much easier to trust all of them, Evan Ingram included, since the last 2 games without Zay Jones now. Christian Kirk, as you mentioned, 20 targets, team high mark. Calvin Ridley, 16 targets. Evan Ingram, 15 targets. So much more easier to trust all 3 of them if Zay Jones is not involved. Not to mention Travis Etienne, who we don't even need to talk about in start-sit situations because he's just that good and getting 20-plus touches weekly. But we're really just waiting for the ceiling to pop off, since it's still Tank Bigsby who has taken every single carry inside the 5-yard line over Etienne to this point. On the other side of the ball, my waiver chats and Discord were filled with Drake London and Kyle Pitts worries. For Kyle Pitts, it's frustrating, but it was also baked into the process the entire time. We talked about last year, or this offseason, how out of quarterbacks with at least 100 dropbacks, Desmond Ridder had the lowest catchable pass rate of all of them coming into the season. So, of course, these highlights that everyone sees on social media of Kyle Pitts getting overthrown, again, that was baked into the process when drafting Kyle Pitts. Now, I don't want to panic on either him or Drake London because we could still see Taylor Heineke. And if they get their doors blown off in London here, like that's a situation where we start transitioning to the next quarterback, since the Falcons are still very live in the weak NFC South.
Yeah, the Drake London stuff is it's tough because he has the bad week 1, you bench him, he blows up and has a good week in week 2, then has a disappointing week 3. It's just, I think this was the concern with the Atlanta passing game coming in, and I thought London would be a little bit more immune to it than Kyle Pitts in terms of the ups and downs. But since London did do well with Desmond Ridder late last year, we had that to go off of. Pitts was out during that span, so that's part of the issue, I think. Right now, Pitts is leading the league in tight end air yards, but these are pretty much prayer yards with the low completion accuracy on target numbers from Ridder. And interestingly, London is like 76th amongst receivers in air yards, so it's not like he's seeing a ton of volume downfield like Pitts is. So I have London ranked as a wide receiver 4 right now until. I'm just hoping that they do make a quarterback change or that Ridder can get things straightened out, because it's just this passing game is not good enough to support Bijan Robinson as their primary pass catcher, and then London and Pitts as viable starts every week.
Is it frustrating that London has just one more target than Matt Collins? Yes.
Yes.
Is it frustrating that he has a depth of target 6 yards lower than Matt Collins? Yes. But at the same time, we're still betting on a talented wide receiver with the first-round draft capital in his second year, whose target share increased from 4.5% in week 1 to 24% in week 2. He's shown us he can earn a team-high share of targets. So that's something I'm still banking on. Yes, I lack confidence in him right now, but also with the bye weeks right around the corner in week 5, I think everyone forgets how tough they are. And we're already seeing how littered the league is with injuries. Drake London is someone we will absolutely be starting as a wide receiver 3 over the bye week. So we cross our fingers, we hang tight, and we don't lose faith, since it's a long, long season. Also, before we move on here, still the utmost confidence in Bijan Robinson, because he seems inevitable to this point. His route participation, 75% in every single game so far. That role is static. It doesn't go anywhere as the team's pass catching back. More importantly, his share of the team's running back carries have increased in every game. These past 2 weeks even, 54%, and then a season high 58% mark in week 3. So we think he's slowly beginning to command everything, and he'll eventually get there. 4, the Steelers at the Texans. Texans being 3-point home dogs. Let's start with Najee Harris, because everyone is rightfully concerned. Even last week, 19 carries and still just 6.5 fantasy points. And that's the kind of way that's pretty much how it seems to shake out for Harris. This offense as a whole, the Steelers are 31st in scoring drive percentage. They have just been absolutely terrible. And right now, I don't even know if the Texans are a get-right spot since they are still playing tough defense. So what are you doing, and how are you ranking Najee Harris?
Well, the Texans are 28th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running back, so there's that. We could hang our head on that if we're trying to tell ourselves a story about Harris. I mean, I've got him ranked as an RB3. He doesn't have much of a role at all in the passing game anymore. He had one target last week where Jaylen Warren had 4 with the 3 catches for 23 yards. His dominating carry still 19-8 last week. So I think we can see ourselves with a 18 carry, 60 to 70 yards, if not a little bit more, with a touchdown, in a good scenario for Harris. I think he has to find the end zone at this point really to pay off in your lineup. But, against the Texans, I think that's a decent possibility that happens.
What about for George Pickens? It seems like, again, it's going to be Calvin Austin and Pickens as the team's primary receivers. But right now, we are pretty much just hanging our hat on Pickens to catch a couple deep balls and Freiermuth to continue being involved.
Yeah, I mean, I think with Deontay out, you're seeing a shift in targets over to Pickens specifically. Freiermuth had the good game last week, but was really quiet the week before. But Pickens seems to be the safe start here. But Calvin Austin is an interesting dart throw, and somebody that trying to add in some of my deeper leagues, just to have him on the bench, maybe start him here and there during the bye weeks if Deontay is still out, because he's a talented guy and caught the long touchdown last week.
On the Texans side of the ball, CJ Stroud, QB 11 in fantasy points per game right now. No interception, as he's also 9th in completion rate under pressure. No defense thrown at him has given him duress thus far. And what we've seen in the last 2 games without Noah Brown is slightly concerning for Nico Collins. Tank Dell, team high 23.6% target share, while also leading the team in routes run in that span. Robert Woods next up with 20.7% of the team's targets, and then Nico Collins down there at 15.6%, just ahead of useless Dalton Schultz at 13%. So your thoughts on Nico Collins moving forward and how you are parsing him with Tank Dell this week?
I do have Dell ahead of Collins this week. So I was pretty optimistic about Nico coming out of the first 2 weeks because he had 2 good games in a row, had the really, really strong week 2, and then we had the quiet week 3 when Tank Dell went off. I have Dell at 26 this week, Collins at 27.5 PPR. So I do think they're both viable high-end wide receiver 3 types, and you could even see them as our wide receiver 2s. But certainly Dell over the last 2 weeks has really staked his claim in this offense and seems to be becoming CJ Stroud's favorite target. And I think after the first 2 weeks, we might have said that, that's Nico Collins. So I think they'll both have their big games here and there. Maybe it won't be as predictable as we would hope, but this passing game is a lot better than we were probably expecting. I mean, I think heading into the season, we were thinking, there'll be a lot of volume, but do they really have the horses, to play? And Nico was an intriguing 10th round, 11th round draft pick. And, I have him on a couple teams and I'm happy to have him. But I don't think we were expecting CJ Stroud to be quite as good as he has been as a rookie. I think there were certainly some indicators that he was the best rookie of this class, but for a rookie to come in, struggled a little bit in week 1 against the Ravens, but had 2 really strong games back to back. And now heading into a pretty good matchup with the Steelers, who have been bad defensively pretty much against the run and the pass. I think it's a pretty good spot for him in Superflex leagues as a QB2.
If someone had the choice tonight, since rest of season, we still don't quite know how Jordan Love and CJ Stroud will fare, who would you start in week 4?
I'm starting Love tonight, but maybe because I'm wearing the jersey. I think they're both.
Yeah, I would say that may have been an unfair question to ask you.
I have Love at 12. So I think this is going to be a
Uh,
pretty high scoring affair tonight. And I've got Stroud at 19. So I think they're both, QB2 types. The quarterback rankings are a little weird this week with, um, some of these QB2s not having great matchups like Deshaun Watson. But I think I have Love at 12, Wilson at 13, Daniel Jones at 14. So that's that type of group there. And Stroud at 19. But I mean, it's hard to argue with Jordan Love's fantasy production thus far. And I think getting Christian Watson back is a boost.
Rams at the Colts has crept into a pick'em game. And it's probably because now that Anthony Richardson has missed what has become a mandatory 1-game absent in the concussion protocol, and rightfully so, is expected back this week for the Colts in what could be a shootout between these two teams. So if Anthony Richardson is starting, most likely he becomes everyone's starter in 1 quarterback leagues. I'm throwing him right back in there. The point is, though, Paulson, that Zach Moss is still, in my opinion, an RB1. You can't handle 92% of the team's running back touches the past 2 weeks. This past game, 32 of 38 over Trey Sermon, and not be plugged in there, especially after your running quarterback comes back from a concussion. You would think if there's any game for the rest of the season that they don't let him bruise himself inside the 5-10 yard line, it's probably this first one back where he's still a little bit rattled. So I'm still very high on Zach Moss in this game.
Yeah, that's an interesting point in terms of how careful they might be with Richardson around the goal line because, initially when Richardson's back and I put him back into the rankings, Zach Moss takes a big hit because he loses some rushing yards and certainly some rushing touchdown upside given Richardson's presence. But he can't, when I initially put in Richardson, Moss slipped to like 20, but I moved him back up in terms of target share, rush share with the backup that's there behind him, Trey Sermon, just basically zeroed out Trey Sermon or close to zeroed out Trey Sermon. Trey Sermon gave Moss virtually every running back touch in the backfield. So I have him at RB13. I wouldn't argue with him being a low end RB1 this week just based on volume alone. I am a little concerned about the goal line carries, but you make a good point about Richardson perhaps being protected this week.
And I don't think we lose Josh Downs just because Richardson coming back. Yes, Downs has been second on the team in targets from Gardner Minshew since week 2, 25% target share with the Colts compared to Michael Pittman's team high, 31.2%. But remember, go back to week 1 from Richardson, and still Josh Downs had a 17.9% target share, was second on the team in targets behind Pittman. So I still think he's a sneaky slot play here if you're desperate in those deep flex leagues. On the other side of the ball,
could I also add Kylen Granson as a tight end 2 type?
You're getting really deep now.
Yeah, I'm going deep. He actually been pretty good this season. And the other thing I wanted to mention with Richardson is that it was basically a game and a quarter of him playing. They basically had a 61% pass run split. So they're not this super run heavy team like we thought or we heard that they might be, where they were going to run the wishbone and all this. It's basically a normal offense right now with Anthony Richardson at quarterback, where he's going to attempt 30 something passes per game if he plays the whole game.
On the other side of the ball, one of the many running backs we have questions about their workload and losing trust in slowly this week is Kyren Williams. I still consider Kyren a top 10 running back, RB1 for sure, that I'm starting over players like Brian Robinson, David Montgomery, if I had that option. But the fact that even Sean McVay came out and said he wants to get other running backs involved, quote, beyond Kyren Williams, I don't know who those players are. Let's start there, because so far, Ronnie Rivers, the past 2 weeks, has 1 touch. Kyren has out-touched him 31 to 1 and has 17 targets in that span. Not to mention that everyone in like the best ball world has been high on day 3 rookie Zach Evans, but the Rams promoted Royce Freeman instead from their practice squad ahead of Monday night over Zach Evans. So they seem to have a preference there with Freeman. But will Freeman and Rivers really steal touches in this backfield? I can't imagine so. So for the time being, I still want to count on that workload for Kyren personally.
Yeah, I have him at 10. I completely agree. I believe it when I see it. McVay go away from Kyren Williams. He's always been one to not really run a committee and to have a bell cow whenever he has a guy he trusts. So again, I'll believe it when I see it. The Colts have been pretty good against the running back position, 3.1 yards per carry allowed to running backs, but 104 total yards, actually 105 total yards on average allowed to the position, 27, 28 touches by opposing backfields on average. So there's plenty of work here. Even if another player comes in and steals 5 or 7 touches, there's still plenty of work for Kyren Williams, I think, in this game.
Where do you have Puka Nacua ranked after last week's floor performance? Because there have been a lot of complaints. And I will just tell you, if you're complaining about a 21% target share and 70 receiving yards, that means Puka has made it as a weekly wide receiver too.
Yeah, the Colts are 27th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to receivers.
Yes.
This is a defense that we're targeting as far as pass catchers. No problem with Nacua. I mean, didn't have the greatest game, but he still went over 70 yards. Just didn't have the eye gouging, mind-boggling target shares that he had in the first couple of weeks. But he's still the wide receiver 1 right now for this Rams team, and he's a low-end wide receiver 1, high-end wide receiver 2 in my rankings.
Still very high on Tutu Atwell as well. Team high 28% target share this past game. And Sharp Football's Rich Rebar brought something to my attention that had slipped past me entirely. And it's still very early, so I don't want to weigh it too much. But we may slowly be seeing some extreme splits like we talk about with Gabe Davis, Christian Kirk, the list goes on, about man and zone coverages and how players perform. There may be something in the air that we need to look at for Puka here, because so far he's only earned 15% of his targets against man coverage, and he's averaging more than 2 yards per route run against it. Last week was the first time that Puka on Monday night against Lou Anarumo and the Bengals was actually pressed for a majority of his snaps at the line of scrimmage. The Bengals also ran out a high rate of man coverage, and Puka struggled. Hence the quote-unquote floor game he reached. The Colts showed us last week also as a team that ran 75% of their defensive snaps from zone coverage in weeks 1 and 2. They actually flip-flop to half and half in week 3, given the matchup. And so if that's the case, and they flip-flop here and throw some man coverage at Puka, maybe just something for us to monitor moving forward. But for the time being, I think it's very clear that it's Tutu and Puka. Tyler Higbee slipped in there with 70 yards last week, but still 4th on the team in targets. So a tight end we can play in matchups. Where do you have him ranked this week?
Higbee I have at 14. I've been moving him around a little bit. I think coming off of his good game last week, he came in a little bit high, and I wasn't really comfortable with him at 10 or 11. But I think 14, 15, and that high-end tight end 2 range is pretty good for him. He's just, we thought he was going to see 100-plus targets, but he's just now he's feeding on scraps after Nacua and Tutu Atwell at this point. So he's just kind of a guy you can play in good matchups. And Indianapolis is 18th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends, so it's not a bad matchup.
To the Vikings at the Panthers, I'm actually quite upset because I thought we were getting Andy Dalton. And if we got Andy Dalton, this game was going to go over. It was going to be fun. But it sounds like Bryce Young is striving to play. And if that's the case, I go back to worrying about the Panthers offense as a whole because it just has zero juice with Young under center right now. Young, who of course is 31st to completion rate from a clean pocket on the season. And we know exactly how Brian Flores will play him because so far through 3 games, the Vikings have ranked top 2 in blitz rate in all 3 contests. They sent the house at Herbert on 86% of his dropbacks. They have no other way to play. And if you're sending the house at Bryce Young, then of course he will continue to struggle. So your thoughts on Adam Thielen and DJ Chark, since that's who we're trying to squeeze in here.
Yeah, Thielen, with Dalton at quarterback, I mean, we're going to have to change the projections if Young is going to be back in. I think Dalton gives you a certain floor, especially against a team like the Vikings, who are 27th adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. I was sort of intrigued by Thielen and, with Dalton at quarterback in a revenge game for him. Not playing in Minnesota, but at home, maybe takes a little bit of the steam out of that. But, the Vikings are 30th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to receivers. And Thielen did have a good game in week 2 with Bryce Young at quarterback, although it wasn't a huge yardage day because I don't think we can expect young to go for huge yardage days at this point. And I just wonder, the Panthers, are they already regretting not taking Stroud ahead of Bryce Young? Maybe it, the Texans finishing and getting that number 2 pick, it turned out to be a boon for them.
Just like the Bears probably regretting that they did not do anything with the number 1 overall pick and still are the same team. We'll get to the Bears in a bit. For the Vikings, the target tree is honed in. Jordan Addison is a player waiting to erupt. His route participation has increased in every single game, although KG Osborne has still run more routes in every game. But it seems inevitable that he will eventually happen. Continues to be a weekly flex option, especially because since the Panthers lost J.C. Horn in week 1, they're allowing over 8 yards per attempt through the air. I talked about Kyren Williams, the concern about his workload. I think I personally go back to that with Alexander Mattison. 86% of the team's running back touches last week, but still just, quote unquote, just the RB10 with no touchdowns. Cam Akers expected to be active in this game. So where are you at in your concern meter right now with Akers perhaps cannibalizing some touches this week?
Yeah, I mean, Mattison, when you look at the box score, had a good game. Like, he seems like he responded to the Akers trade and did well last week. He did. I know he had a fumble that did not get called a fumble. So those that watch the game, are, I see a lot of, Alexander Madison's terrible type talk on Twitter. Okay, but he's still the RB1 right now, as we know it. The Panthers have allowed 4.59 yards per carry to the running back position. They've given up about 148 total yards on average to opposing backfields, with 2.33 touchdowns per game to running backs. So if the Vikings want to run the ball, they should be able to have some success, even if it's Akers alongside Mattison, or if it's just Mattison basically as the lead back with Akers sprinkling in, which is be my guess with Akers, being only in Minnesota for a week. I would not expect him to take over. It does sound like Kevin O'Connell is a little bit irritated with the ball security of Mattison, and I don't know that Akers is necessarily going to be the solution to that, because he's got as many fumbles, but in a lot less carries. Right now I'm still rolling Mattison out as an RB2, but I'm certainly a little less confident than I was last week when Akers was inactive. I mean, there is that chance that either something happens early in the game where Mattison puts another ball on the ground, he's not running well, and then they just kind of hand the keys to Akers and maybe he takes over. But there's also, it's such a good matchup that I think Mattison, if he does get the first 4 or 5 carries, is going to have some success there and earn playing time throughout the game.
For the Buccaneers and Saints, another running back returning in Alvin Kamara, and the red carpet has practically been rolled out for him. No Jamal Williams, who's on IR. Both Kendry Miller and Tony Jones splitting carries last week, but I would imagine with Derek Carr also expected to miss this game, that they lean on Kamara and some combination of Taysom Hill instead. So where do you have Kamara ranked in his return?
I've got him at 20, and I think that's slightly low compared to consensus. I think he's a fine RB2, especially given the landscape that we have. And, probably has a pretty high touch floor relative to some of these other guys in that same range. I mean, you probably feel pretty confident about Kamara in terms of touches over a Mattison, maybe over a Gibbs, even with Montgomery back. So there's that. The Buccaneers have been kind of up and down against the running back position. They're giving up 4.98 yards per carry. They gave up 173 yards to the Philadelphia running backs last week, but they did a pretty good job against the Bears. Khalil Herbert had 35, Roshan Johnson had 32. Did very good against the Vikings in week 1. It was just Alexander Mattison with 34 yards rushing. So it's been kind of a Jekyll and Hyde type of a defense for the Bucs. So I think that their opening is there for a decent game here, but it's going to probably require some receptions, and I'm curious to see if Jameis Winston is willing to check down to Kamara, as frequently as Drew Brees did. I don't think he will ever, but maybe a few catches would really help Kamara's floor.
And I would think the Bucs play Jameis Winston the same way they played him last year in week 2. because they're playing defense the same way. They blitzed Winston on 40% of his dropbacks last season. They're blitzing at the league's third highest rate this year. And Winston had a high completion rate against them last season, but it's because he was dumping the ball off for 3.9 yards per attempt. If he plays the same way because they're blitzing his face off, I would think we get a lot of dump offs and catches for Kamara for a high floor. So I'm also going right back to Kamara, and I would play him in a vacuum over Rachaad White. We're seeing Rachaad White now yet again struggle, 17 carries, 34 rushing yards on the ground. And after the game, when asked about it, Todd Bowles didn't mention Rachaad White personally, but did say he's aware the running game is struggling right now. The issue is Sean Tucker has also been really bad running the ball. And they called Keyshawn Vaughn up, promoted him before the game. There were a few reports about him from Jeremy Fowler, but that led to 0 touches. Didn't matter at all. And so how are you sliding White into your rankings this week?
Yeah, I've got him at 25. So he's a fringe RB2. It's a volume-based play, just fairly high confidence in his touch floor. This is a bad matchup for him. The Saints only giving up 64, 65 yards rushing on average to opposing backfields. A.J. Dillon, 33 yards. Miles Sanders and Chuba Hubbard, 59 yards. Derrick Henry had 63 yards. Tyjae Spears had 27. So the Titans did sort of get some production, but not a ton. Where it could be made is the receiving game. Patrick Taylor had 23 against them. Chuba Hubbard had 34. Derrick Henry had 56 yards against them. So if White can make a play or two in the passing game, that would certainly help his cause. I just don't think there's going to be a lot of room to run against the Saints defense.
And we know that Mike Evans continues to be inevitable. I tried calling my shot for Chris Godwin over him, but it doesn't matter when Mike Evans is playing for a contract and pissed off at the world. And it's not just the 3 touchdowns that's getting him there. These aren't flukes. It's a 30% target share and 49% of the team's air yards. The ball doesn't go anywhere but Mike Evans. So if that's the case, we just continue banking on him weekly. For the Commanders at the Eagles, let's go to the Eagles side of the ball, because now we've seen these last 2 games, whether they meant to do it initially or not, that DeAndre Swift has succeeded immensely in place of Kenneth Gainwell. Even this past week, it wasn't a timeshare. DeAndre Swift handled 76% of the team's running back carries and 74% of their touches overall through 3 quarters. And then when they were up 22-3 in the 4th quarter, Kenneth Gainwell outcarried Swift 7-0, just icing the game in what was a blowout. So we think if the Eagles are even competitive in this game or just putting it away, it's all DeAndre Swift.
Yeah, Swift has been so good running the ball the last 2 weeks. It's not shocking that they went to him as the lead back. You made a great point. I was going to make the same point about Gainwell's. If you just look at the end of game box score, it looks like there's a 50% timeshare, but it was just basically the icing of the game. The game was in hand, so they didn't want to, rough up Swift, who has had injury issues in the past, any more than they needed to. I think the only concern with Swift is that he's not going to sit here and run 7-8 yards a carry for the rest of the season. He hasn't been very involved as a receiver, even though we know he can do it. In general, the Eagles don't throw the ball to their running backs a lot, so I think there's going to be some clunkers here with Swift. I don't know that this week against Washington, who's kind of a middling defense, Swift is the matchups they're 14th. The Commanders are in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running back, so it's not a special matchup. It's not a bad matchup. I think he'll continue to run well. He's pretty hot, and this is a good offensive line, so I think he's a fairly safe play. I just there's going to be some downside here at some point because he just doesn't catch the ball a whole lot.
On the other side of the ball, because it comes down to what we believe game script will be, and it should be a good matchup. Both Mac Jones and Kirk Cousins against the Eagles averaged 49 pass attempts because the Eagles are quietly a pass funnel. Everyone's probably forgotten that since Jalen Carter had no issues finding Baker Mayfield within 1 second of snapping the ball. But the issue is Sam Howell now has clearly been struggling because he's been holding on to the ball too long. only one quarterback in the entire league is taking a sack rate over 13%, and that's Sam Howell at 16%. It's been miserable. Even a couple of those interceptions last week against the Bills were his fault, trying to force the ball where it didn't need to be forced. And so if that's the case, we worry about Sam Howell, maybe even getting benched here in the next couple of games. So where do you stand on Washington's ancillary pieces right now in this game?
Yeah, I mean, last week was a nightmare for Sam Howell, but I think in the 2 previous games, he was trending up. So it all depends on how much confidence that he has built up and how much capital he has built up with the Commanders brass and how much they're going to mark him down for one really bad game against the Bills. Do they have a plan of attack? Because the Eagles are very likely to copy what the Bills did defensively. And do they have a counter to that? Because they clearly didn't last week. I am sort of interested in Howell this week and maybe in a DFS sort of play with the pass funnel nature of this game. I think the Eagles are giving up 41 pass attempts against compared to like 18 rush attempts. So if the Commanders realize they are going to have trouble running the ball, I mean, they might try to run the ball early and establish Brian Robinson, but if he's getting 2-3 yards a pop, they're going to have to throw the ball. This is also a game where the Eagles are likely to jump out to a lead, and that puts Sam Howell and the Commanders in a pass-heavy environment. I really think he could get there in garbage time with some scrambles, 40 pass attempts, and maybe 230, 250 yards passing. And I think this is actually a pretty good spot to roll Terry McLaurin out. I think Dotson and Curtis Samuel are more wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5 types right now, but I do think McLaurin is a sort of a high-end wide receiver 3 this week.
I'm still worried about the target tree and no one having success consistently, weekly, given that it's Terry McLaurin 17% of the targets, Dotson 16%, Curtis Samuel 12%. Logan Thomas also expected back this game when he had 7 targets in week 2, I believe it was. No, it was 3 and got injured. He had 8 targets, 27.5% team high in week 1. And so, yeah, I don't know if there is enough volume to go around despite the Eagles being a pass funnel. But if you believe in it for DFS, because that's really what we're talking about here, then you should go play in the large field tournaments because it will be very low rostered. And I'm not even saying I don't believe in it. It's just that, yes, Sam Howell, there's clearly an issue going on there. Where do you have Brian Robinson ranked? Because we also saw Brian Robinson out-touch Antonio Gibson 10-4 in the first 3 quarters. And then Robinson only played 2 snaps, didn't get a touch, while Antonio Gibson finished off the rest of the game in a blowout.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're looking at Robinson as a RB3 this week, given how much trouble he's likely to have running the ball. And then if they do fall behind, do they turn it over to Gibson as the pass catching back and 2-minute hurry up drill? So I think there's some concern there for him. He is very much the most likely running back to score a touchdown in this offense. And if they do have success running the ball, it's probably going to be him. I just am not real optimistic about the Commanders running game this week.
A running game we are optimistic about is the Dolphins playing the Bills. And let's start there because we have to add context because Raheem Mostert and Devone Achane clearly will not be the RB1 and RB2 together every single week and not score 4 touchdowns each. But I have the utmost confidence in Miami moving the ball in this game. Even if you take away Breece Hall's performance in week 1, and remember, he had 109 yards on his first 2 carries. Don't look at what he's done since those 2 carries. But if you take away week 1 altogether, even the past 2 games, the Bills are 31st. The second most 10-yard runs. They still cannot stop the run. And that was against Josh Jacobs and Brian Robinson backfields. Now we get Mostert and Achane. I'm worried about the Bills defense in this game. So I still like them both. Where do you have them both ranked?
This is an interesting one. If you look at our Bills defensive knowledge seeker report on the site and you can pull up all the running backs that have played against the Bills, there are some wild ones here. They've given up on average 5.57 yards per carry to running backs, 131 total yards to backfields on average, but they've had it like you mentioned Josh Jacobs. They actually had a good game against him. 9 carries, -2 yards against Jacobs, 4 for 22 for Jahmyr White. So, the Raiders only attempted 13 rushes, and that's where the Bills are sort of getting by right now, is that teams aren't sticking with the run against them. Brian Robinson had 10 for 70. And then, as you mentioned, kind of got benched in the fourth quarter just due to the nature of the game. In week 1 against the Jets, we have Breece Hall with his 10 for 127 running the ball, but Dalvin Cook was 13 for 33, 2.54 yards per attempt. So it's really depending on the player here. The only two that have really gone off against them are Breece Hall and Brian Robinson. Still, we have a lot of confidence in the Dolphins running game. We saw what Mostert and Achane did last week. They're going to be able to run the ball so this is one of those teams where I think they're going to stick with the run and have a lot of success against the Bills.
And it was a timeshare. I think that's most important to cite about their usage, because in the first half, when they're still playing all starters, it's not a blowout just yet, although they just kept on putting points on Denver. Achane had 10 carries to Mostert 7, and Mostert out-touched Achane 13-11. We asked, where was the target share going to go? And in that game, Tyreek Hill had 39% of the targets, and the running backs totaled 39% of the targets. Jalen Waddle will be back this game. Everyone's starting him. We don't even have to worry about that question. But that's the target tree now. It's not Durham Smythe or Julian Hill, who ran more routes than Smythe. It's not Braxton Berrios or River Craycraft. Craycraft, who got injured in that game. It is Tyreek, Jalen Waddle, and the running backs. So we have the utmost faith in 4 players alongside Tua in this offense. And that's the most important part to me.
I think the interesting thing coming out of the Denver game, not, obviously the 70 points was very interesting, but, I was watching the box score, and it was very interesting to see Mostert with all these catches early and Achane with more carries, because I think heading into the season, we were expecting the flip. Like, we were expecting Achane to be the pass catcher and Mostert to be the primary between the tackles, outside runner as well. So for that to flip, obviously Mike McDaniel saw something he could expose. Achane rushed 18 times for 203 yards. They scored so many touchdowns. They both had 4 touchdowns each. Obviously not going to see that. And I don't think we're ever going to see a team score 70 and then be an underdog the following week like we are this week.
I would personally start Achane, as some people have questions easily over Najee Harris, easily over Dameon Pierce. I put him ahead of Alexander Mattison personally for me, since I have questions about Mattison's workload with Akers active, especially in this game with the highest total, 54 points on the board. I'm taking fewer touches. We think fewer touches for Achane compared to all those guys who, in my opinion, do not have a ceiling that is worth chasing anyhow. That's how I'm playing it. But I also play fantasy football a little more risk tolerant or a little less risk tolerant than a lot of people. On the Bills side of the ball, we also saw last year that Miami had no answer for Josh Allen. A different DC, but blitzed him on 30% of his dropbacks in their first matchup. He averaged 9 yards per attempt, threw for 2 touchdowns against the blitz. Scaled it back in week 15, only blitzed him on 70% of his dropbacks, and he averaged 13 yards per attempt with 4 touchdowns against man coverage, which they ran at the league's highest rate that week. And then, of course, they get to the wild card. They go back to sending the house at him, and he averages 9.9 yards per attempt for 7 first downs and a touchdown. They had 0 answers. We've seen Vic Fangio throw different coverages, blend everything across the board. He hasn't blitzed at the top 10 rate. He's throwing zone and man at them across the board. But were you ranking Gabriel Davis for this matchup? Since the touchdowns have been there the past 2 games, but he still hasn't seen a 20% target share in any contest. These past 2 weeks, he's really just getting there on those touchdowns.
And you have a Gabe Davis zone man split take on this as well.
Except Miami I can't predict the defense, so I don't know.
Well, Miami's ran 43% zone so far, according to the numbers that I have. So they're a little below average on the percentage of zone. Gabe Davis just is like Mr. Touchdown scorer. I mean, he's a decent bet to score a touchdown every week, but volume is not going to be there. So you're going to get some clunkers, and that's why he's so divisive in fantasy circles, because he's pissed so many people off because he's had bad games. When he doesn't blow up, he has a bad game. I have him, ranked as a wide receiver 4 type. This is an interesting spot for him, though, because this could be a very high-scoring game. If Josh Allen has success against Vic Fangio's defense, there's a good likelihood that he's going to score another touchdown. He doesn't have that target floor that Stephon Diggs obviously has that makes him such a safer start than Gabriel Davis.
I also like Dawson Knox over Dalton Kincaid. The Dolphins have allowed 5 catches and a touchdown to the Chargers in week 1. They allowed Hunter Henry and Mike Gesicki to combine for 11 catches, 85 yards, and a touchdown. And we don't count Adam Troutman as a human being, so don't just ignore what he did last week on 78% of routes. But the point is that the way Dalton Kincaid is being used is pretty much the worst for any fantasy tight end. A useless player right now with a 4-yard depth of target. And Knox and Kincaid have run the same exact number of routes. And it's Knox, of course, as the tight end who was only behind Mark Andrews and end zone targets the past 2 years coming into the season. It's Knox who has 3 end zone targets tied for the team lead. So Knox is still the player to start over Kincaid until we get different usage for Kincaid, since the Bills could have just drafted a slot receiver. I have no idea why they chose to draft a tight end instead. But for James Cook, the issue is that we can't get his ceiling so far because he has 1 career carry inside the 5-yard line. Both Damian Harris and Latavius Murray have outcarried him inside the 10-yard line to date. So where are you ranking James Cook in this matchup?
I have him as a low-end running back 1, 29th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. The Dolphins are. So this is a great spot for him. The touches have been there. If we would look back and, he's getting 17 touches in week 3, I think we'd feel great about that. On the season, he's got 54 touches total. And we knew this heading in. It was going to be an issue around the goal line. They weren't going to slam him into the line to try to score short touchdowns. It's going to be Latavius Murray, I think, even ahead of Damian Harris, but both of them are being used. So I think this is a big yardage game, big touch game for Cook, but for him to hit his ceiling, he really needs to score a touchdown from, outside the red zone, because he's not getting a whole lot of work. I think he did get 1 carry from the 3 last week, if I remember correctly, and only gained a yard. And then Latavius Murray, I believe, punched it in. So he did get an opportunity inside the 5. He just wasn't able to cash in.
That was his first career 1. Yeah, that's where he gets it from. For the Bengals at the Titans. Let's begin with the Titans because, yes, DeAndre Hopkins is still sitting here with his 24% target share, but it is not mattering whatsoever as this Titans offense just continues to be absolutely dreadful. So where do you have Hopkins ranked on the week?
Fairly low. I have him at wide receiver 36. So he's sort of in that struggling group of Chris Godwin, DJ Moore, maybe Jerry Jeudy, that type of where, they're good players, but can we count on them based on quarterback situation, target shares, et cetera? Just sort of, against Cincinnati, this is an interesting game. I expect Cincinnati to throw the ball a lot. There could be some points scored on their end. So does that force the Titans to sort of open things up a little bit and attempt some more passes? He is getting a good target share, but he's just kind of a, volume-based wide receiver 3 right now. You're not expecting any, 100-yard games from him or anything at this point.
And if he does get more target share, what is happening from Ryan Tannehill? Does it even matter anymore? That's really what I'm trying to figure out. And a lot of my high stakes leagues, Chigo Conko was dropped, and it just wasn't even worth it to pick him up because you can't even use him. Like, when would you ever play him? So they're just down so bad right now. And that trickles down to Derrick Henry, who also has never been more game script prone his entire career. Henry ran 6 routes last week. They don't even keep him on the field since Tajay Spears is right there with 18 touches in 2 games. So I, too, am worried about Derrick Henry. How do you see this matchup faring for him?
Cincinnati's been kind of gashed by the running back position, although they're just in terms of adjusted fantasy points allowed, they're 3rd. So, they've done a pretty good job overall. I think Henry, you mentioned it, is the concern here. I mean, he led the league in yards per route run last year, running backs. And I know he's not a high volume guy, but it's absolutely worth it to give him a pass once a quarter and on a screen or a dump off and give him an opportunity to get ahead of steam out there in the open field. But they are not playing him as much this season due to Tajay Spears. and that is hurting his floor. It doesn't give him as many. I think in week 1 we saw it where he had a so-so game running the ball, but he had 56 or something yards receiving, and he was able to put together a pretty good game based on that. And we're not seeing that on a consistent basis this year, which does make him a little bit worrisome. He does still have a very high touch floor, and if they're going to score a touchdown running the ball, it's very likely going to be him. But we're starting to get into that range where we need him to score a touchdown for him to really pay off.
He averaged a league high 23.9 touches per game last year, and he's been under that mark by at least 6 in 2 of 3 contests so far because of the game scripts. So that's why we go to the other side of the ball and say, well, Joe Burrow is clearly not Joe Burrow right now. So much so that I'm even more than happy at a 1-for-1 position where as long as he doesn't throw over 400 yards, he doesn't kill me. I'm more than happy starting Russell Wilson, Brock Purdy, those kind of guys over Joe Burrow just for this week because their matchups are significantly better and I have more confidence in them. But Joe Burrow, 98% of his snaps last week from shotgun as they try to protect him. At least we know they kept Jahmyr Chase and T. Higgins involved. T. Higgins did not get there again, but where do you have T. Higgins ranked for everyone trying to parse through where to start him this week?
Yeah, I mean, I'm maybe a little bit more bullish on this prospects here for Joe Burrow and the passing game maybe than you are. He was estimated to be a full participant in practice, doesn't have the sleeve on his calf anymore, so maybe he's getting back closer to 100% this week. The Titans are they're a pass funnel. I mean, they're really good against the run. I would not be surprised if Burrow attempts 40 passes in this game. And that I think boosts T. Higgins into wide receiver 2 territory, where just from a production standpoint, I think he had the one big game in week 2, but week 1, week 3 has been really disappointing. But I think they get it going. Both Higgins and Chase probably deliver starter caliber numbers this week against the Titans. Again, a pass funnel that I like to target and quarterbacks and receivers against this team.
For me, it's definitely not about the defensive matchup. We're not worried about the Titans' sieve of a secondary. It's down to Burrow's health, which is why when people call it get right spot, I'm like, the Titans don't also magically heal you. That's not a get right spot. A get right spot because they're so bad. Burrow's been under 5.5 yards per attempt in all 3 games. He threw 49 times against the Rams, and he only got to 259 yards. Like, that's miserable. So I'm still a little worried. Again, I don't care about the 1-for-1 position. I'll gladly take the safer quarterback with an equally high ceiling, in my opinion. But the calf sleeve coming off is news to me. That's great news. And very quickly, before we move on from this one, Joe Mixon's last 2 games without Chris Evans, who had a knee injury in week 2 and then healthy scratched in week 3, 94% of the team's running back carries, 90% of their running back touches. The ball does not go anywhere else since they're obviously not playing Travion Williams in any role ahead of Joe Mixon. So keep starting Joe Mixon, even though the Bengals obviously suck at running the ball.
Well, you also have the Titans 2.7 yards per carry allowed to running back. So it's definitely a volume play, and you're hoping he can, like Jerome Ford did last week, fall in the end zone once or twice.
Oh, let's get there because the Ravens are taking on the Browns. And I left last week encouraged about Jerome Ford. And so I'm curious to get your ranking on him for everyone because in the first half alone, very clearly pass-heavy game plan the Browns had going in. 24 dropbacks to 6 running back carries. Even then in the first half, Jerome Ford 60% of their team snaps and 13 routes to Kareem Hunt's and Pierre Strong's combined 2. They didn't want to use any other running back. And Jerome Ford still got there at a pass-heavy game script because of his route participation. Even that receiving touchdown he had was a double move. I saw Josh Norris, Underdog's Own, mention that Jerome Ford played wide receiver in high school. And you could tell when you watch the film that they're not just throwing him out there for flat routes. Like, he's actually running legit receiver routes. So ranking for Jerome Ford this week.
He's coming in a little bit higher than consensus. He's at RB22. Baltimore's 23rd in just the fantasy points allowed to running backs. I'm fairly optimistic about this game. He was 56% snaps last week. Kareem Hunt was at 20. Pierre Strong was at 11. Touches maybe you could comment on the touches, but Ford had 12. Kareem Hunt had 7. Pierre Strong had 6. I'm not sure if that was a game script situation, but Ford was not really there at the start and then he started, but he wasn't getting a lot of touches early on. Then they ramped up his workload and got him the 12 touches and the 2 touchdowns. So, I'm reasonably optimistic about him just moving forward as the RB1 here, but it is interesting that they involve Pierre Strong here after adding Kareem Hunt as the RB2 to Ford.
And for the wide receivers, it's clear what's happening here, that only 2 players matter in their passing game at that position. Elijah Moore, 25.2% target share. Amari Cooper, 24.9%. David Njoku next on the team with 11% of the targets. Hasn't reached 5 targets in any game just yet. So I consider, like Tyler Higbee, like all the other tight ends, I consider David Njoku strictly a matchup player at this point since he's not earning targets. And I will play him in softer matchups as such. But right now it's clear Cooper and Elijah Moore. Moore hasn't gotten there for fantasy just yet, but you would think it's coming. He also has 6 carries through 3 games as well. On the Ravens side of the ball, it's also getting pretty condensed because it is Zay Flowers, Mark Andrews, and Odell Beckham, who is not practicing after that ankle injury in week 2 and wasn't earning targets before that anyways. Rashad Bateman came out after week 3 and said he restrained his hamstring. So Rashad Bateman's closer to a what if for his entire career than he is being a flex option for us so far this season. So what are you doing now with these pieces? They're shifting running back land mines included.
Well, I think maybe one of the underreported stories or trends here is that the Cleveland defense is so good. Through 3 weeks. Now, will that continue? I don't know. They were a good fantasy defense last year, and they spent a lot. If you remember when I did my, which teams invested in defense, the Browns, I believe, were one of those teams that were fairly big spenders on that side of the ball. It's paying off. They're just tough to run on. They're tough to throw on. So Zay Flowers is lower than he's been in the last couple of weeks. I think I had him ranked as a low end wide receiver 2. He's more of a wide receiver 3 in the rankings this week. Although, as you mentioned, there's attrition at the receiver position with Beckham, Bateman dinged up or out. So it's really Zay Flowers, Mark Andrews, and I think Nelson Aguilar has been operating as maybe the 3rd receiver there with those, behind those 2 in terms of target tree. So I'm not super optimistic about the Baltimore passing game this week due to the matchup with a very stingy Cleveland defense.
And I do, yes, like you said, in reference to who the Browns have played so far, the Browns defense is very good, but I wonder if they're that good. I'm still somewhat skeptical. At the same time, the Ravens have so many injuries. It seems like they may be getting back Marcus Williams and Marlon Humphrey this week, which would make this a total to probably bet the under on. But I'm still worried about Ronnie Stanley and Tyler Linderbaum and their offensive line. That's the injuries I go back to, because then whatever I think about the Browns defense is irrelevant because they still probably get to Lamar Jackson quite easily. For the running backs as well, I think Melvin Gordon is the play in deeper leagues since Gus Edwards, I believe, is still in the concussion protocol, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
I got him ranked the highest of the Baltimore running backs at 34. So he's a low end RB3. That's the best matchup against this Cleveland defense. I mean, Cleveland's 3rd in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, 1st in adjusted fantasy points allowed to receivers, and 13th against running backs. So, I mean, it's only 3 weeks of data. I mean, things are going to shake out further, but the best matchup really is Gordon. Unless you look at Andrews, there's 6 against tight ends. So it's just a tough defense all around to score on.
Everyone is panicking about Justin Fields, and rightfully so, even though he did have a season high 11 carries this past game, because even with 24 carries through 3 weeks, he is still the QB 14 in points per game, just not delivering anything higher than a 12th overall finish among quarterbacks to date. So where are you ranking him in what should be, you talk about a get right spot, technically on paper should be the easiest performance for Justin Fields this season?
I've got him at 10. Denver is 31st adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks, which is amazing that there's a team that's worse, and it's the Cardinals in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks after what Tua did last week. I mean, I think Fields kind of called his shot after week 2 in that he was going to go back to the way he knew how to play, which is, I think, more scrambles and taking off and running a little bit more. This will be a weird game. This is like the movable object and the irresistible force of the movable object of the Denver defense and the resistible force of the Chicago offense. Like which unit is worse as to how the ball is moving and how many points are scored in this one. Because both sides. I mean, I think the Denver offense has the advantage on the Chicago defense, but I don't know who's got the advantage on the other side of the ball. So Fields, though, has always got that 40, 50 yard floor as a runner if he's running. And they did seem to let him run more last week than they did the first 2 weeks. And he obviously has 100-yard, rushing upside with a touchdown as well. That's how he got there as a fantasy star last year.
It seems crazy to say, but Broncos offense is as safe as they come. They're scoring a touchdown on the 10th highest rate of their drives. Russell Wilson's the QB8 in fantasy points per game, and that's without them playing their best player on offense at all. Since even this past week, Marvin Mims, yet again, just 11 routes, but still over 70 receiving yards, not to mention that 99-yard kick return for a touchdown. At some point, the flip switches. I mentioned that in the waiver wire column that we need to be ahead on Marvin Mims. I don't know when it's coming, but the more Cortland Sutton, who has had a 28% target share the past 2 weeks, since Jerry Jeudy is very clearly still banged up. Sutton fumbles twice on Sunday and that blowout, including within 30 seconds of the halftime, which gave the Dolphins back the ball inside Denver's 20. Brandon Johnston, 2 penalties that eliminated 2 touchdowns in that game for pick plays and holding. The more these errors happen from the rest of the Broncos receivers and the better Marvin Mims continues to play, they just can't help. Peyton cannot help but eventually put him in the lineup. So he's someone, after you lose by 50 points, I just tell myself, if I have question marks about wide receivers, if I have Jahan Dotson, these other guys we have questions about, it's like, this has to be the game. Like, even if it's the 4th most routes run among Denver, that's better than being 7th. So I don't mind Marvin Mims if you are getting desperate out there, and I still want to be ahead on him compared to everyone else.
Yeah, I think, not all of our listeners are in these leagues where Mims is necessarily rostered either. So I think if he's out there, even after a couple of good games, if he's still out there, stash him. And maybe you're not starting him every week, but Judy's banged up. Sutton is, a little older, could lose some snaps. If he gets into this wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 routes run for Denver, and as efficient as the offense has been, then that's going to be a boon for him.
And for the running backs, where do you have Javonte Williams? Right now, both Khalil Herbert and Roschon Johnson, although it's a 2-headed backfield, we like that, are unplayable. But for Javonte Williams, I think this is the game everyone's targeting. He was involved also for 80% of the team's backfield touches in the first half until, of course, it was a blowout, and then they started mixing in both P. Ryan and McLaughlin. But how do you have him ranked for week 4?
I have him ranked around 18, 19. I think this is a good spot for him against the Bears. They're not great against the run. They were obviously the week 1 against the Aaron Jones was a really bad game for them. Javonte, the matchup is great. 31st in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. The Bears are. I do think that there is a scenario where Khalil Herbert and Roschon Johnson are playable. Denver is actually last in the league in fantasy points, adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. Obviously, the game last week played in a big part of that. And I think this game could be high scoring because neither defense is particularly good. So there's a way that they get there, but I have them both ranked in the 30s. So it's not like you're trying to start Johnson or Herbert in this game. You just might have to. And I think it's a worthy dart throw given the matchup.
Raiders at the Chargers, and another matchup I'm pissed off about, because if we get Garoppolo, this game is hot, considering the Chargers can't stop anyone through the air. The only defense in the league allowing, or one of only 2 defenses in the league allowing 130 receiving yards from the slot, and one of only 2 defenses allowing 120 yards from the boundary. However you want to attack the Chargers through the air, you can have your way. But if it's Brian Hoyer, no one will have their way except Davante Adams, because Adams survives no matter what happens. And Hoyer in his last 2 starts literally benched in both for the Patriots. We have zero faith he can carry a passing game in this one. So where are you ranking Jacoby Myers, who we have seen still pop with Davante Adams, both who are now earning 73% of the Raiders' targets since the ball goes nowhere else?
Yeah, the Chargers are 31st adjusted fantasy points allowed to receivers. They've really struggled against the pass. But if Garoppolo's out, and I assume that he will be out given the nature of concussions, you almost always miss the next week.
Yep.
We're not even sure it's Hoyer. It might be that Aiden O'Connell.
I mean, I want it to be O'Connell, but O'Connell hasn't been active yet. So we just have to assume it's Hoyer, but then also we have to assume he's getting benched because that's all he's done.
I got Myers at 38, so a less confident play. I think Devontae still is a pretty confident wide receiver 1. He should see most targets from Hoyer, so you just sort of start him every week.
Is there any concern for Josh Jacobs, who is clearly struggling? What we're seeing is these running backs, Javonte, Breece Hall, Jacobs, get more touches, like they are earning the touches, but they're still being so inefficient with them because of what happened last year. That's kind of what you argue when you say you're playing the long game with recovering ACLs for Breece and Javonte, and then for Jacobs leading the league in touches. His bones just grinded down, and now behind a worse offensive line, according to like last year's and this year's metrics. It just seems like despite getting the touches, obviously the efficiency is not there.
Yeah, it's a volume play if you're going to start him, and this is a weird week. Specifically at the running back position, there's usually 10 or 12 running backs that I feel great about, sometimes more, given their matchups and talent. But I think this week there's 5 that I feel great about. McCaffrey, Pollard, Bijan, Kenneth Walker, and Travis Etienne. After that, maybe Mostert, and then you got Henry just with volume, and Jacobs with volume, and James Cook, but he doesn't score touchdowns, and Kyren Williams, we talked about him. So it's one of those things where Jacobs, okay, you roll him out there because you got a pretty good chance at 15 to 20 touches, and we usually follow the touches when it comes to fantasy points for running backs.
On to the main event, because everyone fought for either or both Josh Palmer and Quentin Johnston on waivers. What we saw last week, in my opinion, is evidence that Palmer is the short-term plan. Johnston can still get there because the Raiders secondary is also so bad. But whenever Mike Williams was carted off in the third quarter last week, it was Keenan Allen and Palmer who ran a route on 100% of Herbert's dropbacks through overtime, 10 dropbacks. Quentin Johnston was only out there for 3 of those routes, playing exclusively from 3 wide sets. So where do you have those two ranked for this week?
Yeah, I completely agree that Palmer in the short term is the better play. In the long term, I think there's an argument for Quentin Johnston that, we saw what Palmer could do last year in a bigger role, and he did all right. Like, in the games that Keenan Allen or Mike Williams missed, he did produce. The 2 games where Williams missed, Palmer averaged 6 carries or catches for 58 yards on 9 targets, played 94% of the snaps. So we're going to see that sort of route running usage from him. When either Williams or Keenan Allen missed last year, 7 games, Palmer averaged 5 catches for 50 yards and 0.14 touchdowns on 7.7 targets. So not a huge amount of scoring of touchdowns, but 9.0, 7.7 targets, that sort of usage is great. Last week, he had 4 for 66 and a touchdown on 7 targets against Minnesota. He had the really slow week 1, week 2. He's not a great talent. He's not going to solve your receiver problem, but he gives you another player that you can plug in good matchups and possibly get a week like you got last week with 4 for 66 and a touchdown. So the thing I want to mention on Johnston is he's going from wide receiver 4 to wide receiver 3. And that means if that's the case, and he's getting those wide receiver 3 snaps, he's going to see the biggest jump in playing time from whatever 20, 30% up to 70, 80%. And that could lead to a spike in production for him. He just hasn't been able to beat out Palmer to this point, and that's what makes me worried about him, certainly in the short term. He certainly should be added and somebody to be stashed for the late in the season, because we have seen time and time again that rookie receivers, especially ones with high draft capital, tend to emerge or explode at the end of the season, heading into their sophomore season.
And For Johnston, my other concern is that at 6'3", 208, I'm still curious how they'll use him because they tried throwing the ball to him downfield in the preseason, but the incorrect analysis, and maybe he grows into a role that he didn't do well in college, but everyone tries to pigeonhole him into Mike Williams' role, but the issue is he wasn't good at downfield catches in college at TCU. He recorded the 11th fewest contested catches out of 102 receivers with 100 targets in the Power 5. Just like Chase Claypool in the league, who's been terrible at getting downfield and doing contested catches, Johnston actually needs to be used underneath. Like, he needs to be able to leverage that 7.7 yards after the catch per reception that he averaged in college and just turn upfield, not be swung 20 yards downfield, because I don't think he's capable of doing that. There was a report from The Athletic that the Chargers are purposely bringing him along slowly. That's why Palmer is playing ahead of him. And so I do wonder if that's what they've been training him for. So we'll just be curious to see his usage this week. But right now, yes, Josh Palmer definitely over Johnston, although it could be as early as week 6, since the Chargers go into their bye in week 5, that Johnston emerges in 2 wide sets instead. Also,
I just wanted to mention the tight ends as well. I don't know if you were going to go to that, but Gerald Everett, I think, is a little more startable. And Donald Parham is like, what? You think Everett's not more startable?
I mean, both are on thin ice, but sure.
Yeah, I think Everett, like, there's a scenario where they're not going to trust Johnston as much. Maybe they play more 12. I don't think Parham. I think Parham is like a touchdown or bust type player, but I think Everett certainly could now fill the role as the number 3 option there in that passing game. But then, Austin Eckler comes back and things kind of shift. But as of right now, Everett is ranked a little bit higher than where I had him the last couple of weeks because of this shift with the Mike Williams injury. I think there is some upside for him there in the tight end 2 ranks.
Be careful how you speak about Parham. Your tight end 6 in points per game on 33 receiving yards. The man is somehow surviving. And quickly for Josh Kelly, if you want to quit, everyone listening, and in your rankings, even Paulson, if you want to quit him, that's fine. I don't blame anyone. But I will say, last week, he got 86% of the backfield touches. I like to follow usage. Don't pay attention that his last 2 games, he's turned 25 touches into 56 yards. I know it's been bad. He only has 2 targets, 1 catch for 5 yards, but he still sees everything. So I kind of jam him up there, like alongside Jerome Ford, although I would start Ford over him and say, you're getting all the touches for 1 more week, assuming Eckler's out, because Eckler's eyeing that week 5 bye. I'll start you 1 more time.
158 total yards on average allowed by the Raiders to opposing backfields.
Yeah.
If it's going to happen, it's going to be this week against the Raiders. This is about as good a matchup as he could hope to get.
Everyone has tried selling me on Najee Harris because it's supposedly a get-right spot, but they don't understand that the Raiders this year have been a worse run defense than the Texans. So it's like last week, 19 carries for 65 yards was Najee's get-right spot, and he did not get right. So it doesn't work like that. For the Patriots at the Cowboys, we saw Dallas have their foot on the gas for the first time all year. And we got a season-high route rate, 79% routes for Tony Pollard as an every down running back. We got a season-high route rate, 64%, which is not an elite threshold, but still, Jake Ferguson, foot on the gas. Ferguson also still second among all tight ends and red zone targets, just behind T.J. Hawkinson, 8-7. And then, of course, a 3-wide set that we thought between CeeDee Lamb, Michael Gallup, and Brandon Cooks, all who recorded 7 targets with Ferguson. So how are you parsing between these wide receivers moving forward?
Ferguson, I have ranked tight end 13 this week. New England is middle of the road against tight ends. CeeDee Lamb's a solid wide receiver 1. New England is 4th against the receiver position. So it is a bit tougher of a matchup for him than he's used to. I don't, have a ton of confidence in Gallup, even though he had a pretty good game last week. Brandon Cooks, it's just hard to get behind any of these guys due to the volume that they're likely to see behind Lamb. I think the interesting guy is Ferguson because he plays a position where it just doesn't get a whole lot of targets, and he's been seeing pretty consistent targets. And as you mentioned, consistent red zone targets. And he's basically delivered Dalton Schultz numbers so far from a fantasy standpoint. So I'm not real high on Dak Prescott. I do think that they kind of go with a I mean, New England is first in both quarterback and running back fantasy points allowed, so they've been pretty stingy from that standpoint. But Pollard is a no-brainer, must start every week. He's my number 2 running back this week.
He's doubled up the next closest running back and carries inside the 10-yard line. So at least we're getting that usage from Pollard. And for the Patriots side, it's still really only Hunter Henry or Ramondre Stevenson. There's no one else you have any faith in. I know people were panicked about Zeke's carries in week 3, but that was also the one game the hurricane affected. As we were concerned about other games, it actually did affect that Patriots game, which then led them to just stuffing the ball on the ground instead.
Yeah, I would say, Ramondre is a solid RB2. There's a little bit of a concern this week with the revenge factor that they are giving Elliott multiple chances to score touchdowns when they otherwise would be splitting those between Stevenson and Elliott. So the revenge factor here, I think, could play into an Elliott, 60-yard game with a touchdown as opposed to Stevenson getting those carries. So that's my one concern. Coaches tend to give players against their old team more opportunities than they otherwise would to score touchdowns, because it's a good time for everybody in the locker room. But so that's my one concern, I think, with Stevenson this week. But I think you have to, given the nature of the position, the RB2 ranks this week, he's a pretty solid start.
For the Cardinals at the 49ers, yes, the 49ers are favored by 2 touchdowns, but the Cardinals have also covered the spread in their first 3 games, have been one of the briskier teams in the league. No one told them they're supposed to be tanking. Josh Dobbs also leading the league in completion rate under pressure. And we've seen Marquise Brown emerge now because, unlike DeAndre Hopkins, who's not getting enough of the team's pie to be usable, Marquise Brown has a 33% target share the past 2 weeks. He's getting fed all of the targets, and thus he is flexible every single week in this environment.
Yeah, I agree. I took, and I don't know if this is a good idea or a bad idea, but I took the 49ers in my survivor pool for those Super Bowl tickets, John.
I'm always worried about division games in general.
Yeah, they're favored by 14 at home, and I just feel like this is, the 49ers are just a lot better than the Cardinals, and I think the 49ers are probably better than the Cowboys and the Giants. So I think they can get this one. Plus, it's at home. So that's why I'm going with it. We'll see how that works out for me. I've already burned the Chiefs, so I can't use them against the Jets. Yeah, I think Marquise Brown, I think you hit the nail on the head. Marquise Brown, very playable as a wide receiver 3-4 type. You just, you may not get a whole lot of scoring out of the Cardinals on a weekly basis, but he and James Conner are getting it done with volume right now. So even though the 49ers are a bad matchup defensively, I think, there's enough there for the Cardinals to produce for those 2 players.
James Conner, who you would also start over someone like David Montgomery tonight, right?
Yeah. I mean, you just get that touch floor with Conner, and he's been solid enough. Also, if the game gets out of hand, he'll catch some passes. So I think Conner's is the safer play.
James Conner currently the RB13 in points per game in PPR leagues. Rondale Moore also just keeping an eye on, because we can't get there when he records 4 receiving yards on 6 targets. Like, his targets and routes don't matter, or 8 receiving yards on 6 targets. But the fact that they've even come out and said they want to experiment with him, I think that means running back more, since he had that big 50-yard touchdown from the ground this past game. If that's the case, then we get more carries plus the 6 targets. Now I'm listening. Now you're just a poor man's Deebo Samuel, and I'm interested in you. So something to keep an eye on this week. For the 49ers, I think the biggest news is Deebo Samuel being banged up. I'm not aware of his I don't believe they've practiced as of Thursday just yet, but DMP Wednesday following that injury he suffered in game. And if Deebo's out, just like we saw with Ayuk out this past week, we know what happens. We know Kittle is then involved in the receiving game. Otherwise, when both Deebo and Ayuk play, Kittle does not matter in the receiving game. Last year, we just go back to those 4 games Kittle started without Deebo. And remember, 24% target share, 16.6 fantasy points per game, led the league in receiving touchdowns over the last 5 weeks of the season.
Yeah, Kittle and Ayuk both get a huge bump if Deebo sits. It's just, that's the way it is. Ayuk probably will be ranked in the top 15, top 12, somewhere in that range. And Kittle will be, if not the top, he'd probably be number 2 tight end after Travis Kelce if Debo is ruled out.
Sunday Night Football, Chiefs at the Jets. The Jets signed Trevor Siemian. I don't think it matters. We're hanging our hat on Breece Hall's touches continuing to increase. The first time this past week that he handled 50% of the team's backfield touches. They've been bad, but they're touches, so at least we get that. And then Garrett Wilson, we still just need that touchdown. The first 2 games, the wide receiver 22 and wide receiver 25, because he scored a amazing catch on a bad throw. This past week, you see what happens. Wide receiver 48 when he doesn't catch a touchdown. So it's always concerning, especially in this spot against the Chiefs defense that since Chris Jones has gotten back, they are a threat.
Yeah, so Wilson's a bet on talent play. And normally we're talking about a bet on talent with a, quarterback 20 to 25 in the league, just kind of average, below average play. But now we're doing a bet on talent with Zach Wilson, who's offering amongst the lowest quality targets, amongst the lowest fantasy points.
The lowest. Yeah.
Per pass attempt, per target. So, he needs to score a touchdown. There has to be some kind of fluky long catch because it just isn't going to be the stable supply of targets. Now, this is a game against the Chiefs where they might have to throw it a lot more than they want to, and then that volume might support him as a wide receiver 3, wide receiver 2. Not from so much from a starting standpoint, but like end of week scoring. I mean, he might get there based on just volume alone because he is far and away the wide receiver 1 in this offense. There's nobody else even close, and in terms of talent or really targets, Allen Lazard's getting some targets, but it has to be a volume standpoint. So can the Jets stay in this game by running the ball? They might be able to if the Chiefs struggle offensively and the defense plays out of mind. But I mean, if the Chiefs jumped out to a 14-0 lead, how much are the Jets going to throw? That might get them there.
Yeah. The Jets hanging around in this game. They can run the ball, but that doesn't mean they're hanging around in the game. And Dalvin Cook, we've seen, he made the drop list in the waiver wire column for everyone to look at. 10.5 touches. RB hasn't finished any higher than the RB 33 in PPR leagues in any game. You just can't start him. Even for the bye weeks, I can't imagine anyone being in that position. For the Chiefs side, it really comes down to Travis Kelce and everyone else being involved. Kadarius Toney, obviously injured. Just 2 routes this past week. I did think what was the most interesting note, though, something to consider for deeper leagues, is Rashee Rice ran as many routes in the first quarter before it was a blowout as Sky Moore. The 2 wide sets were Marquez Valdes-Scantling and Justin Watson. But right after them, Sky Moore and Rashee Rice, not a high rate, but tied one another with 45% of the team's routes. And Rashee Rice has been their most successful receiver so far. So that's kind of the deep league note I'm keeping an eye on.
Yeah, Rashee Rice, 31% of the snaps, 18% of the snaps, 51% of the snaps in his first 3 games. So now he's over that half playing time type stuff. And he led all the receivers with 7 targets, 5 for 59. So he's up. Justin Ross is up 9 to 13 to 38% of the snaps in the first 3 weeks. MVS has kind of dropped to 53% from being a 63 to 82% player in the first 2 weeks. Sky Moore is basically holding steady. So it's short of, and so has Justin Watson. So it's, we're sort of shifting some routes and some snaps to Rice and to Ross, which they did say, at the start of the year that they were going to be package players to start and that they wanted to grow their roles. And I think we're starting to see that.
We're seeing one of them grow at least, but still none are confident starts unless you're in deeper leagues. Agreed. Like Scott Fishbowl, where I do start Justin Watson, but my team is good, so don't laugh at it. For the final game, Seahawks at the Giants, who are favored by 1 point. Let's get into the Saquon Barkley news because he did participate in practice on Thursday, trending towards playing, even if it's limited. Let's assume Barkley plays. How are you treating him?
Seahawks have been pretty stingy against the run this year. So it's not a really, a great matchup. I think, we didn't see anything really out of the Giants running backs last week. It was a really bad offensive showing for them. But Barkley back, I think, puts him, especially with the landscape at running back right now, puts him in a high touch, low end RB1 type role. Even though it's not a great matchup, he can get there as a receiver.
And for Darren Waller, I know people are freaking out, but was the tight end 4 in week 2. So I don't know why we're losing our heads. And also the last 2 games, he's led every player on that team in routes run and targets. Legitimately nothing to be concerned about. And now Daniel Jones gets a smash spot against the Seahawks defense that has allowed 300 passing yards and 27 points in each of their first 3 games. It's just an obvious bounce back spot for every one of the Giants.
Yeah, it should be. Seattle's 28th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to quarterbacks. They're 11th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends. So those are the 2 key metrics there. And they're actually, I thought they were really stingy against the run, but it looks like I lost Breda in the rankings here. They're 25th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs, but I think they had a low yards per carry, at least entering last week, allowed to running backs.
They're so injured too. And it's not like the Giants running backs, although we didn't expect them to do anything at all, did anything on the ground anyways. Breda had 8 touches for 17 yards. He just happened to fall into the end zone. So whatever. If they get that production again, it doesn't matter because it's all going to be Daniel Jones in this game anyways. On the other side of the ball, everyone knows where the ball goes to. It is DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, Jackson Smith and Jigba, still irrelevant at this point of the season, so we don't even need to talk about him. But for the running backs, everyone seems to be concerned that Kenneth Walker's touch share dipped to 62% compared to Zach Charbonnet, whose share of the team's touches have increased every single game. 13.5% week 1, 24% week 2, 30 or 29% in this week. His snap rate also continuing to increase. So where do you have Kenneth Walker ranked right now, who's still a season high 21 touches in week 3?
Yeah, you mentioned that. I was gonna counter that. Maybe they had so many running back touches in that particular game against the Carolina Panthers that they wanted to work Charbonnet into the fold a little bit more, and that they maybe have a touch limit for Walker, right around 20, 21, 22, somewhere in there, because he's had 16 and then 18 and then 21. So the same argument could be made for Walker that his touches have increased every week. So I'm not really concerned about him at all in this game.
With that, Paulson, what else do you have on the site for everyone?
Sneaky Starts got posted yesterday. I'll be doing a chat in our Discord for 444 subscribers later this afternoon. So I think we're heading into the end of the first quarter of the season. A lot's happened. We've had a lot of injuries already, and we know a lot more about these teams. But if you just keep sort of piecemealing your roster together, if you're having some injury problems, maybe get a win or 2, stay close to 500. We can still make a run at the end of the season.
And if you're down right now, I wouldn't even worry about it because fantasy football currently is dictated by how many Dolphins players you have. Do you have Puka and do you have the Dolphins? If so, you have a good team. Otherwise, the rest of the top seeds in your league right now, just click on their names. I guarantee you they're just scattered with non-stacks and just trying to piece together their lineup. It will come back. It will regress. It will even out. The Dolphins can't continue scoring at a 20% higher touchdown rate than every other offense. Maybe they can. They're revolutionizing offense right now. But it's going to come back. So you just have to stay with it and keep on working and keep being here with us every single week. Until then, we'll be back on the DFS show Friday, 6 p.m. Eastern, if you're into that thing. So be a little bit kinder than what's required. We'll see you next time.
Go Packers.